Hello everyone, welcome to another topic lesson on Grace Darling. So in our Grace Darling topic, we're going to be looking at who is Grace Darling and how did she protect others, and then how can we do the same and protect others too. So can we learn about a famous historical person? Our famous historical person is Grace Darling. But let's have a think about those words. What does famous mean? Have a little think for a minute. Think about people you know that are famous and think, what does it mean to be famous? Why do you call them famous? Let's have a little look. So somebody who is famous is a person who is known by many people. So that could be all the people in the country, all the people in the United Kingdom, or it could be people all over the world. Now let's have a look at the word historical. What does that actually mean? Do you know? Have a little think. And let's reveal it, shall we? See if you got it right. So something historical is something that happened in the past. So Grace Darling is our famous person because everybody heard about her and she became famous. So she was known by many, many people. And also, when she was alive, it was the Victorian times. And so that is a time that was in the past. Now, let's have a look at exactly where she came from. If you can see over this side, we have got a map of the United Kingdom. Now, I've put a little red arrow down the bottom here. Where that arrow is pointing to in the UK is your school, St Mary's School. So there we are all the way down the bottom in England. And then if we go all the way to the top of the United Kingdom, past this line here, we get into Scotland. And this red arrow here is pointing to the Longstone Lighthouse. And if you remember, that is the lighthouse where Grace Darling lived with her family. Now, imagine we were to zoom right in on this area here. We would get to a place in this little part of the sea here called the Farne Islands. And this picture here is what the Farne Islands look like. Lots of very small little islands, and some of them, if you can see, like this bit here and here, they'd be too small. No one would be living on those, but they'd be huge rocks in the sea. And if we look up here, follow this red arrow to Longstone Island, this is the island where the Longstone Lighthouse was, where Grace lived. So she didn't live on the mainland. She didn't live in a city where there were lots of people. She lived on a tiny island. And this next picture here is a picture of the lighthouse, the actual lighthouse up in Scotland where Grace Darling lived and where that rescue happened. So have a good look at that picture. Now, why do you think that a lighthouse was built right on that spot? The photograph of it will give you some clues. Right, now we've had a look at some evidence from the photograph. We will see if any of you thought of any of these. Well, let's look at that picture again. You can see that there are lots of rocks in the sea. There isn't a lovely, smooth, sandy beach. Lots of rocks, and some of them go into the water. They're not sticking straight up. So there are lots of dangerous rocks nearby, and they put a lighthouse there to guide the ships safely around those rocks, because if you have a think about ships today, they have computers and all sorts of technology so that in the day and night, they will know exactly where the rocks are and what the sea looks like that they're in. And in Grace's time, in Victorian times, they didn't have computers. They didn't have anything, any technology like that. So at night time, they would have had to use maps and things. But a map is okay. You can see roughly where you are, but you won't know if you're just about to come up to a rock hidden. It may be a rock hidden under the water. So that's why lighthouses were extremely important. And then the last one here, it's not just rocks that can be a problem. If you've got sand under the sea or mud, but it suddenly gets quite shallow, so it's not very deep, the rock and the ship can get stuck, stranded on that shallow water, a bit like the storm whale. So let's think about that night when Grace Darling rescued people and became a famous historical person. So on the 7th of September, and the year was 1838, Grace Darling, she was only a teenager. She was 19 years old, and she lived with her family in the Longstone Lighthouse, and it was just a normal day. So let's have a think. What do we do on a normal day? It's not very normal at the moment, is it? Because lots of people are doing school at home. Some children are in school some days and at home other days. So it's not especially normal. Things are a bit different at the moment, but there will be some things that you do every day, like getting out of bed, having a wash, getting dressed, having something to eat. And so for Grace, it was exactly the same. She got up and got out of bed. And what kind of things do you think she was doing? It might have been in Victorian times, but she would have still had to do the same things as us. So she would have done the same things. She would have got up, got dressed, had a wash, ate something. But that day didn't turn out to be a normal day for her at all. Now, this picture here is a picture of the SS Forfarshire, which was the ship that was wrecked in the storm that night. Now, the Forfarshire may look like an old-fashioned boat to us, but at the time, it was a luxurious ship. Now, luxurious means it was very fancy. And the first-class passengers on board would have been travelling in style. So that means it probably would have cost them quite a lot of money to go on that journey, and it would have been very fancy and nice inside. But during the night, a great storm was blowing. I'd like you to try and imagine now, what would it have been like on that ship, excuse me, in a great storm? And what I've done, if I'm going to change my screen now to help you imagine what it would have been like, we're going to listen to a storm at sea. look at the sky, the dark, dark black clouds, and the thunder and the lightning, and the huge rolling waves, and the howling wind. And just imagine that you are a passenger on the ship, listening to that outside. Or imagine your Grace darling in the lighthouse, tucked up in bed, with that noise and wind howling outside. Now I will put the link to that storm on Dojo for you, so you can play it while you're doing this lesson. And also there's another link which I will post to an interactive little quiz activity that you can do where you have to add in the missing words. Now, when you press the link, you should see a screen something like this. And it has 3 different options that you can choose from. So maybe you start off with option 1 and you can do the others if you want to. Okay. So imagine that terrible, noisy storm in the dark. Now, Grace and her father set off in their fishing boat. Here they are on this painting. The storm was so bad, they had to row for a whole mile just to make sure that they weren't too close to the rocks themselves, because they don't want to get shipwrecked as well. There were 9 people from that shipwrecked ship that were clinging to some rocks nearby. But their boat, Grace's boat, could only take 5 of them. Grace had to row backwards and forwards just to make sure she could stay near the survivors in that little boat, while her father took the first lot of survivors back to the lighthouse. And so when they got the survivors in the boat and they'd rowed back to the shore, to the lighthouse, her father then had to row back again and get the others. Now, all of them, when they got them all to safety in the lighthouse, all of them were trapped in the lighthouse for 3 whole days because of that terrible storm. And it took 3 days for that storm to be over. Now, let's have a look at this. Can you guess what this is? Now, this is a photograph of Grace Darling's rowing boat that her and her father used to rescue those passengers. And this is the actual real boat that they used. And at the moment, it's in a Grace Darling museum. Now, if you look at this photo on the right here, can you see it says Grace Darling? Grace Darling is painted on the sides. So the rowing boat, the fishing boat, was named after her. Now let's have a think. Imagine that you were sat in that boat that night, rowing to rescue those people. How do you think you would have felt being in that little boat? Have a think for a minute. Well, let's have a look. What kind of boat is it? What's it made from? This is a pretty small wooden rowing boat. It's a small and simple boat. It has no lights and no engine, so they would have just used those oars that you can see lying in the boat. You have to be very strong to row a boat like that normally, but especially in a storm. And there was no engine to help them and no lights. So going out in the dark on the rough sea, they would have just had the light from that lighthouse to help them. On the sides are very low and there's no roof. So in waves like that, with the howling wind, they could easily have gone over the side into the sea. And they would have become very, very wet and cold. So, got a couple of tasks for you to do now. The first task is, I want you to imagine that you are part of that rescue. So imagine that you are either a passenger on the ship, or maybe the captain of the ship. Now here I've got some pictures. This is a picture of a Victorian lady, a passenger on a ship. And here we have a drawing of Captain John Humble. And Captain John Humble was the captain of the Forfarshire ship in this rescue that got wrecked. So imagine that you are one of those. What would it feel like? Write a few sentences about it. You could start with, I feel, and then you could use the conjunction because. Tell us how you feel and then say, why do you feel like that? And down at the bottom, I've put some vocabulary in here, some words, so to help you with your spellings that you might want to use that are connected to the story. And the other task imagine what they were saying here. Here I've put some suggestions. So here is Captain John Humble. And I thought he might be saying, oh, I don't like the look of this storm. Or it is my duty, my job, I must get all my passengers and crew to safety. And then maybe the passenger could be saying, oh, whatever shall we do? What will become of us? Who will save us? So there's a few ideas for you to help you get you going there. Now we've got task 2. Have a look at this picture. This is another picture done of Grace Darling and her father. What do you imagine that Grace and her father were saying to each other? You could copy the drawing, do a little drawing yourself and do some speech bubbles and write what you might be saying there. Or if you liked, you could just write 2 sentences and you could say, Father is saying this, and on the next sentence, Grace is saying this. So you don't have to do the drawing, but you might like to. Okay, hope you enjoy that topic lesson and doing those tasks. And when you finish them, of course, don't forget to take a lovely clear picture and upload them to Dojo. And I look forward to seeing them.